We're live on the YouTube. It's Thursday, the 8th of April, 2021. If you're watching us, you're not watching the telly, you're watching Broadsheet on the telly. You're very welcome with us tonight. Here we are again, nearly the middle of April. And where does the time go to? Joining me as always on the panel, we'll go over the north side tonight to say hello. Jimmy, that beard is looking rather Christmassy. How are you doing?
It's getting out there. And I have to say, your introduction is very camp, Neil. Can I say that? Is that okay? But, I'm gay rights. I'm totally down with this. This is no problem. But, the beard is out of control. I don't know really what to do with that. Just to commit. I'm kind of committed now. I could be a Dubliner, or a Smurf.
I was thinking of that Mel Gibson film where he plays a very bitter Santa Claus just when he came on.
That's what do you call him? That's Billy Bob Thornton. Bad Santa.
No. Oh, you haven't seen the Mel Gibson one. Oh, Jimmy, that's for later. So that's for later.
Okay.
And of course, the Duchess of Dublin 12, the Countess of Crumlin, Vanessa Foran. Hi, Vanessa.
Hi, everyone. Duchess. Jeez. I should have my own Bridgerton show.
You do have your own Bridgerton shows. Put a lot of work into it. But of course, you're not here to listen to us blabble. We've got a very special guest tonight, but I am going to get Vanessa to do the honours of giving our honourable guest tonight a greeting, an introduction that is worth listening to. So Vanessa, do you want to introduce our guest tonight?
Well, of course, good evening, Conor Lenihan, former Minister for a whole string of sciences, technologies, biodiversity, and probably bog cutting or whatever it is. Welcome to the show, Conor.
Thank you very much. It's great to be on it. I've never been on it before, obviously. So
I'm thrilled you're here because you wrote a piece in The Village a few weeks ago, but effectively property and politics, and as you know, that's a big thing for me as well. And it was particularly around the Official Secrets Act and the connection with Leo Varadkar. And there's a number of things that I want us to explode further, and you and I have spoke about this at length. And but there was one thing I'd like us to start on, really, and I suppose you're coming from inside the bullpen as well, having been a minister. And so you've sort of you've actually been hands-on with dealing with this type of property and the seal of government and the seal of the board, because you're a director. You serve as a director as well, don't you, with a company? So there was one thing in particular that struck me in your piece was about how Leo Varadkar was flagging it was in the public interest. Now I can blow that wide open, by the way. But what struck me was that Leo went there with it, but never thought that of even consulting the Attorney General. Like, do you know what I mean? Like that from there on, it always fell apart from me. So can we talk about the whole story of when you signed the Official Secrets Act, and just maybe take us from there now, and as to how this has just gotten absurd beyond like, why have an Attorney General? Why have a criminal justice system,
Well, I suppose the thing I wrote about in the article in Village magazine was a very simple thing, that one becomes very aware very suddenly, actually, within a week, certainly, of being appointed to a senior servant came up to my office and having it prior to that asked for an appointment. And he put this letter in front of me, and now, Minister, you have to sign the Official Secrets Act. And I said, by God, I've been a minister a week already. Were you not afraid that I might have been leaking official secrets for the last week? And he said, we kind of got it. A mild laugh at it, but it was quite a serious moment, because it's a very vivid reminder to you that you have changed status. You are no longer, in a real sense, just simply a member of the Dáil. You're a member of the executive branch of government, which is a distinct and different thing. And what struck me about the whole issue regarding Varadkar's breach of the Official Secrets Act is that there was certainly, if not directly by him, certainly some of his spin doctors were trying to insinuate that the Official Secrets Act certainly didn't cover him as Taoiseach or as a member of the government. Well, it does. And I suppose I was making that point in the article, that everybody who takes a position of executive responsibility in our civil and public services has to sign the Official Secrets Act. And it is a serious thing. It's more honoured in the breach amongst the political class, because the political class, as you know, thrive on the oxygen of publicity. And in recent years, it's become rather more absurd in that now politicians in executive roles try to, if you like, acquire influence with the media by leaking almost everything that happens around the cabinet table, whatever happens at their individual parliamentary party meetings. So there is an issue around this whole matter. But I think some of the more interesting breaches have occurred under this particular government, this three-party coalition, where, for instance, the Taoiseach himself effectively leaked to the Sunday Independent a report that affected victims of institutional abuse. And I think that was an extraordinary moment for which there was nobody batted an eyelid, that the Taoiseach came out and gave an interview about a report which the victims were told would not be commented on by government until it was actually released the following Monday or Tuesday. So, you know, I think there is an issue here about official secrets. I'm not somebody for secrecy. I'm very much for openness in government. But I think we've got to a point now where we have to look at these issues and in a sense, take them far more seriously than we currently do. I think the more serious one than the Varadkar one is the one concerning the victims who learned of a report that profoundly affected them and heard it from an interview. Well, I don't know whether it was a leaked interview or how you describe it, but it looks to me and sounds to me like a leak by the Taoiseach himself. And that doesn't seem right to my mind, that should happen. And I also think that the Official Secrets Act is a difficult one to patrol and monitor. In my own time in government, you know, one knew colleagues were leaking sometimes against you or sometimes taking information from your own portfolio and leaking it to curry favor with the media. But I would think from the kind of conduct of good government or governance, if you want to use that particular word, that one does have to have some discipline around an executive team with regard to leaking sensitive or confidential information. I'm not a big advocate of the Official Secrets Act being used against, for instance, whistleblowers, and we have legislation to cover whistleblowers and people who have actually signed the Official Secrets Act but feel a moral or public obligation to release information, you know, and I think that's proper and valid, that people like that do have an opportunity to do that. But that's my point. Sorry, I hope I haven't gone on too long about that, but I think that the issue in terms of Varadkar, more serious in the Varadkar case, actually is not the Official Secrets Act breach, but the breach of the Corruption Acts. Because in fact, in his case, I'm not that concerned about the Official Secrets Act breach, which he claims, I quite frankly don't understand how he could say this, but he claims he was doing it in the public interest. But the more serious issue is that very few people seem to realize that in Ireland, corruption can often be what I would describe as insider dealing, people doing favors for friends. It may not look like what we call classic or stereotypical corruption, which is, you know, I give somebody money to achieve a particular result, which I would describe as a kind of a traditional stereotypical view of corruption. But if you, as an insider, have privileged or confidential information that only you have by dint of the office you hold, and you pass that and confer a benefit on somebody else by passing that information to them, that's a very serious offense. And it doesn't matter whether there's significant money or no money involved. If I, for instance, hand to you some privileged information, which puts you at an advantage relative to competitors of yours, be it in business or whatever occupation you're in, that is a serious breach, not just of ethics and morality, but it's also a breach of the law when you talk about government and the proper and clean conduct of government business in the public interest. And I think Section 19 of the Corruption Act is worth looking at in terms of the definition around corruption. And it's very wide. And this was only passed in 2017, this Act on Corruption. And it's a very welcome thing because it defines it very widely and not necessarily just in terms of monetary benefit, but it defines it in terms of handing a privilege or benefit to somebody else.
Connor, sorry, Vanessa, because this is Vanessa's belly particularly, and you know, I support her in this ethics and probity in politics. And is there within the Fianna Fáil party or any of the parties for that matter, and particularly with reference to Leah Riker, what you just referenced, which there is a criminal investigation as far as I know, but is there no mechanism for ethics oversight inside the party? Does nobody, where's the mechanism for that, for somebody to get a slap on the wrist or to be told that that's actually beyond the bailiwick of real politics? It's now slipped over into something else. Is there nothing written anywhere, no mechanism for that?
But there is a cabinet handbook and a handbook that guides the performance and behaviour of ministers. And in fact, one of the adjudicators in relation to that matter is the secretary of the Department of Taoiseach. He or she, if the man or woman, sits over the process of ministerial and cabinet minister oversight in terms of their ethical conduct and any conflicts of interests or otherwise that are either declared or not declared. And so really it's a responsibility for ministers to be aware of the various pieces of legislation governing ministerial behaviour, but also if there is a dispute, it is up to primarily the secretary to the Department of the Taoiseach or the cabinet secretary to oversee whether, in fact, when you have an issue, for instance, I had several of them where you were in receipt of, for instance, some form of hospitality, and a person might be linked to a certain company that may, in fact, be seeking or part of a public procurement call or contract, and one would seek the guidance of whether it was appropriate to attend or not to attend a particular function, where the principal, if you like, host of that function was somebody whose company was, if you like, bidding for a public contract. So internally within the government, ministers approach the secretary at the Department of Taoiseach for advice and guidance on what is the appropriate thing to do in terms of the day-to-day.
So in terms of Golfgate, then would they have gotten that kind of a recommendation, or would that have fallen under that remit and just ignored it, or how did that happen?
Well, I think that happened in fairness to the participants, and I'm not a big supporter of the idea that, for instance, our European Commissioner Phil Hogan, even though he's not of the same party as me, that he was sacrificed as a result of this controversy, because I think the primary responsibility in these, we call it ethical misdemeanors of one kind or the other, is a minister a serving minister in government who's supervising the rules and regulations and laws. So I feel that Phil Hogan was wrongly treated by the government.
I think he was set up. But I think, Conor, Phil was set up by his own party, to be honest.
Yeah, well, it's always easy to go for the conspiracy here, but I mean, I just felt, I didn't feel it was in the public interest, in Ireland's Inc.'s interest at that particular time, to lose what was a very high-profile portfolio in the trade portfolio that we held through Hogan, and also somebody of his experience over many years. Whatever you think about his politics and what he did when he was in government here, he had a very senior portfolio, which would have been influential and helpful to Ireland, both from a Brexit perspective. But even I suspect, had he been negotiating, rather than the current incumbent of that job, who did negotiate the vaccine contract with AstraZeneca, I don't believe Phil Hogan would have made the same mistake.
I'd have to reluctantly agree with you on that. And
yeah, we would actually. Yeah,
so there's a very serious flaw there in that contract that it uses the phrase best efforts, and anybody who's had any degree of political executive experience making procurement contract calls, either in the private or public sector, knows that the phrase best efforts means nothing. And that's what's happened here with the European Commission, that they signed a contract.
Prove it.
Well, you can't establish what best efforts represents, and also.
Well, interestingly, with the Phil Hogan thing, it seems to me, as a paper reading citizen, that he was just simply a sacrificial lamb, and it's alluding back to what you were saying about currying favor with the media and optics and all that stuff. It seems to have gotten to a tipping point, the way I see it, with everybody with Twitter accounts and TikTok accounts. I know social media is important and stuff, but that's probably what Vanessa's alluding to. It wasn't a classic conspiracy theory. It was somebody had to be offered up. Something had to be seen to be done about it,
Well, I think people saw an opportunity and went for him, because they were very quick to tidy up Simon Coveney as a prospect for the commissioner's chair as such. Can I, Jimmy? I don't want to stop your flow, but can I bring Conor back to the Criminal Justice Act there? And that kind of was given another set of teeth when they brought money laundering and the money laundering and counter terrorism finance legislation in under that in 2017. But in your article you quote section 7, and the one word I noticed, now I could be wrong, maybe you just didn't include it in your article, okay, but you defined it as the definition of corruption to include obtaining a gift, consideration, or advantage, right? And you know what? If that's what it is, there's one word missing, and the word is influence. And influence, folks. And this is where the insider trading thing comes from, because people think insider trading, they think it's a Wall Street thing, and people having information about a share and knowing whether to sell it or buy it or stuff like that. That's not freely available to everybody else in the market. It is insider trading is also having information you're not entitled to. Now, we all have that. We all get gossip we shouldn't know, right? But when you have information that you're not entitled to and you use it, that's insider trading. Now, when Leo put that information into this doctor's hands, there's no way he could possibly pass any test that was in the public interest, because it was a tender. It was a contract information. You know, so anything around public tendering or public contract and public negotiations, there could be an element of price fixing going on. So that's why I think I'm very surprised that the Attorney General was never sort of even on the outskirts of this story when he said it was in the public interest. He never even reached for that assistance. I'm a bit. It kind of blew my mind that that's where he went, and then he came back, and then he said he's sorry, he shouldn't have done it. For a senior government minister, you know, it sort of all speaks back to, and Conor, you went here with this as well about how stuff gets leaked, and it might be from a different minister taking stuff from, let's just say, your department and leaking it to the press and stuff like that. You know what? I just think there's a culture of they just don't think that accountability applies to them. And it's like they're not amongst us. You know, even the board of a credit union, and I can speak at length about that, they sign a pledge, a confidence, the seal of confidence, they call the pledge, the moment they sit in the board. And that's the exact same as any form of governance. It's the same in the board you sit on yourself. What stays in the boardroom, what's said in the boardroom stays in the boardroom. And that's exactly what the Official Secrets Act is supposed to be for government ministers. What's in the cabinet room stays in the cabinet room. It's as simple as that. But the sheer disregard for that type of confidence and probity and even ethical behaviour is where this has all gone wrong. And it starts with the political parties themselves, Conor.
Oh no, I'd agree.
If parties, now I know this, you're going to be reading all about this in a piece I'm doing for the Village. Okay, so like it's kind of like these are spoiler alerts, I suppose. But ultimately, if political parties were a bit more careful in even vetting candidates, people that kind of live to a higher ethical and work to a higher ethical standards, there's absolutely no sense that there was just no sense that there was a higher standard required of a government minister in any of the behaviour, not just in this government, but in previous governments. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think there's always been that issue in Irish politics. I think, thankfully, we have a whole panoply of legislation now to stop the kind of outright corruption, which obviously I saw and everybody experienced with the tribunals, particularly the one set up to investigate the source of Mr. Hawley's money. I wrote about that in a biography I wrote about in 2015. I don't think we're back in those bad old days where, you know, politicians can receive vast amounts of money and have an incredible lifestyle and not have to account for it. But I do and am concerned, not just about politics, but also public administration and the ranks of the senior civil service, where there's a kind of a carousel of insiders monopolizing positions and appointments. And I'd instance two very stark examples that have happened in the last month or two, where we saw salaries, for instance, for Mr. Paul Reid, who is head of the HSE, and that salary that he enjoys would certainly be merited if he were the head of some huge health service. In fact, his salary exceeds that which is available to the head of the British NHS. And, you know, that's a country with a population of 60 million.
The NHS is a very different animal to the HSE. You have just even different districts of the NHS, like a different trust would be bigger than the HSE.
Yeah, so we have a situation where what I would call a classic insider gets a job as the head of the HSE with no previous footprint or experience in health or the delivery of health services. In fact, he was in, I think, one of the North Side local authorities. That was his position prior to becoming head of the HSE. Fingal, that's right, that's correct. And so that's a very significant issue. Both the pay levels related to the population and the relative, if you like, responsibility that particular individual holds. I believe those salaries are huge and aren't linked to the relative responsibilities of the position itself. But then if you go to the Department of Health, Robert Watt was shoehorned, as I understand it, or there was an attempt certainly to shoehorn him from his position as head of the Department of Public Service into a job without having to go through an interview as head of the Department of Health, which in the last 20, 30 years has less responsibility because of the creation of the HSE. But he was going to be given, or is now it's been spoken of being given, an extra 89,000 for a position that arguably has less responsibility than it had 20, 30 years ago.
Where did I go wrong, lads?
But
you're Fianna Fáil. Listen, let me tell you.
There's a really interesting point here, is that Robert Watt, not unlike Mr. Reid, has no particular footprint in health delivery or health policy. He was previously a civil servant, and a very good one, I want to emphasize, in the Department of Finance. When I had interactions with him, when my late brother was Minister of Finance, so I'm not criticizing him as a civil servant. But again, I don't think the salary that's being accorded or about to be given to the new head of the Department of Health is within reasonable levels for the size and responsibility of the health policy that he will supervise. And I think it's very ironic that he also has no particular expertise in the health area and is now being asked and encouraged to take the position on the basis that he's going to get more money because of the serious responsibility it represents, but doesn't at the same time have any particular technical expertise in the area. And I think this is a big problem in Ireland, where, and I use the word insiders advisedly here, that insiders seem to be able to pitch up in all sorts of different jobs. And it also applies in the public television broadcasting station as well, where people seemingly retire but then are recycled back into nice remunerative gigs after having retired.
So, we've been there with that, Conor. I can tell you.
Frank
Sinatra, these years are still burning.
Frank Sinatra has notoriously retired several times, 7 or 8 times. But I mean, it seems to be the norm.
But you know what's interesting?
The norm in RT.
This sort of upper echelon, or the elite, you know, is they've no interest in benchmarking themselves against their own peers in, like, we'll just say the NHS or in other governments around the world. They're only interested in benchmarking everyone below them in the ladder. Have you noticed that? They're not interested, like Micheál Martin's Taoiseach salary, he's not interested in benchmarking that with Boris's or
and that goes into D Forbes this week in RT as well, refusing to take a pay cut, but it was only people above a certain, people under 45,000 a year weren't going to be taking a pay cut. It was only the upper echelons, and they just refused it. It's endemic, it's systemic, I think. You know.
Yeah, but I think it's a culture that they just think they're above it all. They just don't think it applies to them. cheat us all doesn't apply to them. Am I? Do you know what I mean? Like I feel like this is an area I've written extensively on, and and we're going into it. It's just that there, like we talk about insider trading, and Conor, you were saying it was, you were using money and about profit and stuff. It's not always about money; it's about influence.
Well, that's right.
And
I would look at the
and I
Bradford
have
thing
a
as an
big
example
problem. Sorry, Conor, but I have a big problem with the appointment of an ex-Fianna Fáiler into the standards in public office commission. That's Fianna Fáil having one of their own inside. So as far as I'm concerned, spoiler alert, there's no independence there now. They have one of their own in. It's the exact same argument I make about the religious orders employees, Micheál Martin and Norma Foley, sitting around the cabinet table. That's the Catholic Church having their people around the table. That influence is there. That's a conflict of interest that has to be recorded when they're discussing, let's say, the commission report. That was a conflict of interest in that room.
Sorry, which conflict of interest are you referring to there in terms of?
Because they have because she's employed by the Presentation Sisters or the Presentation Nuns or whatever they call themselves.
Yes,
that's her. Unless she handed in her notice and when she was elected. Unless she did. If you did, Minister, fine, I'll take that back. But if you haven't left your job permanently, you have a conflict of interest every time an issue comes up around the religious orders. So either you have to remove yourself or absent yourself from the vote around the cabinet table, and you record it as a conflict of interest. In your own board, you record conflicts of interest.
Well, that's right. And obviously there are strict rules in relation to that within the cabinet and within the government generally, that if you are or have or perceive yourself to have a material interest of one kind and the other by way of employment, or if you like seconded employment, as you might depict in this case, you are obliged to either indicate that in the discussion or in certain situations absent or not be part of the decision itself. In other words, as a minister, if you feel you know the person very well who is pitching for the contract, you may in certain circumstances decide to allow the permanent secretary to make the decision, the Secretary General of the department to make the decision, rather than it be a ministerial choice as such.
Yeah, there's no sense of sort of separation of duty or taking a hands-off approach or absenting yourself from certain decisions. And the previous government, well, when I say the previous government, I mean the one before the acting government, Dennis Naughton was a minister and he was in charge of the tender for the broadband rollout. And several times he met with one of the principals in the tender, promoting it, several times. And it never occurred to him once, not once. And this guy is highly educated. Like, as far as I remember, he had a PhD out of UCC. So, well, now I could be wrong there. Apologies if I am. But he should have had a lot more cop on to know he should never have met the guy. Even if he bumped into him in a bar and say, hello, how are you? No, I can't talk about that. And that would have been it. But he encountered him several times. And he should have removed himself from all those encounters. And what worries me even more is nobody in his department even thought to record it or to memo the meetings with them. No senior servant kind of stepped in and said, no, look, we may need to remove you out of this situation. Look, I'll stand here and I'll record I'll make a memo of the meeting. None of it. When the biggest contract ever rolled out in the state, obviously this was before we knew the National Children's Hospital was going to run away with itself. But there was no sense of even, I keep using the word probity, but there was no sense of being professional and managing it independently, and as Leo would say, in the public interest. There was no public interest on display, and that's senior ministry.
Well, I think
I believe that.
I'm not mistaken, he had to resign, if I'm not
He stepped down. No, he stepped down. And yeah, but I mean, the fact that it was repeated and it never occurred to him that at somebody who's been in government for that long, in a senior ministry, that it never occurred to him that his behaviour was compromising a major tender contract.
But no, I agree with you there, because I do remember on occasion in the various ministries that I served in, and there were quite a few of them, if you look at the old CV, but we were always reminded by the department officials, and we often refused to take formal diaried meetings, whatever about informal running into people. You know, Ireland is a small place. You will, by definition, run into people at various events. But formal meetings are very much frowned upon if somebody is pitching for a sensitive contract with the government or with your department. So, you know, these rules are applied, and people are and should be aware of these if they're serving as cabinet minister. So I am a little bit surprised at that myself, because certainly there was great sensitivity in some of the departments I served in when it was known, for instance, let's say it was one of the accountancy bodies or firms, and they were pitching for a particular contract with government, but that one would have to, if they'd made separate requests even before they went in for that procurement, but those diary meetings came up for discussion in the roll into a formal public procurement, one was encouraged not to go ahead with the meetings because it might create a suspicion amongst other people bidding for that you were some way biased in favor of one, because, you know, rumor being rumor, people say, oh, so-and-so for KPMG or whatever was in with the relevant minister a week or two or a month before the relevant large public procurement contract came up. So there are rules of required conduct in relation to ministerial meetings and what's recorded, what's not recorded. And so I am surprised at the Dennis Nocton one. So I think a certain looseness has come into the picture in recent years, and hopefully there'll be a tightening up in the years ahead. I think it's very much needed, because one of the big problems in Ireland is that whether you are biased in favor of someone or not, the country is so small, you run into and know so many people, and people know you. It's very easy for people to construe in their minds that, you know, maybe I have a drink with, you know, one of you, will say privately, and you then are pitching for some public contract. People will put 2 and 2 and make 5, even if there's actually nothing untoward occurring. So there is a requirement to be slightly, as you suggest, hands off when it comes to certain decisions. And, you know, I mean, not for no reason, judges for many, many years are very careful about how they socialize and mix because of the sensitivity of the position. And the same for ministers. You simply cannot be seen in public with people in a run into a major public contract. You can't even be seen to be with them in a kind of a social sense, because it does, in a very small country like Ireland, create rumors almost overnight. You know, your man was with herself in the Shelburne.
You know what I don't get about it, Conor, because you said it seems to have loosened up in recent years, and you think the, you know, politicians and senior public servants and, you know, those that are vying for these contracts, you'd think they'd be a lot more savvy, because everywhere you go there's somebody with the phone up in their face, you know, or something. It should, like, you get away with a lot less now, even though they seem to be just running away with everything. I mean, you and I spoke today about the Micheál Martin's lockdown breach. Like, have a lash off this now, because you're going to love this.
Hello,
so, yeah. Do you know, we were talking about the the breach, like, as if it just lockdown restrictions don't occur to him at all. And you introduced a very good explanation that it wasn't matters of state he was dealing with. This was, you know, a local function.
It's a local function, yeah. I mean, I just thought it was amazing. I mean, I only read it the other day, but I suppose, apropos what you said earlier, the guidelines don't seem to apply to the highest in the land. I find that rather bizarre in the context of Ireland having the longest public lockdown in Europe. I think we still have that particular dubious record. But I just think it's very amazing that there hasn't been huge media follow-up, because if you threw or cast your mind back to the August of last year, when there was an absolute public outrage over the golf incident in Clifton, where, as I said earlier, a cabinet minister resigned, a European commissioner was also forced to resign. I think Alaska Hirlik of the Shannon had to go. A whole plethora of official office holders or people who achieve an emolument from the public purse had to leave their positions because of what some depicted and saw as a minor infraction of these guidelines. But I do understand that there's some element of prosecution now being mounted by the Gardaí. What kind of surprised me there last weekend when I read the piece about Micheál Martin is that the Taoiseach of the country is doing the same thing. And I suppose you're tempted to quote Johnny Logan, what's another year? It seems another year seems to have made the difference, that the public aren't up in arms or an
Oh, well, there is a thing. There is a thing called COVID fatigue that we were discussing with. It's more scientific with Luke, but everything is so ephemeral. Even in the last year, the lead time, the headline time, is now a matter of hours or just days, probably. So something like what Micheál Martin did, people are just so fed up of everything at this point in time. There's no longer a major transgression, although it is, of course it is, but it doesn't seem like that. We're inured, I think.
Yeah, but inured is a kind of interesting word. I know I do see the point about the fatigue, that people are in a myriad of different ways. I'm quite certain that the public themselves are doing their own thing at this stage because they're so fatigued from it. But I think when you're the head of government, it's a bit.
Yeah. Oh, trust me, I'm not making excuses.
I've been being a minister and tried to enjoy myself occasionally. When I wasn't being a minister, when I was out socially, one had to be very careful, even in that situation with no COVID around. So I was really a bit stunned that Derek clearly was forced to resign for coming down to the function, and the Taoiseach is going pretty much to not as many at it, but I think it was certainly in breach of the guidelines. He's going and attending the same type of local function, and there doesn't seem to be any consequence at all.
He got a very bad turn of the dice, though, didn't he, Dara? Because he wasn't a minister, and then he was only a minister a week. Or
2 days, yeah, 3 days.
Yeah. Oh, stop it,
Connor.
Come here.
Connor,
Yeah,
I was wondering.
Neil.
Sorry, Vanessa. I was wondering if I could switch focus just a little bit. Seeing as if you're here, if I could ask you some questions about your view on the current leadership we're seeing in the country and how COVID's been tackled. I hate to use the word, but unprecedented is a word we've been hearing a lot about the last year. But I think from a political perspective, I think it's fair to say, that politically, the government that we've had, or that we have, I should say, is dealing with something that none of their predecessors have ever had to deal with. So it is new territory for them. I kind of wanted to ask you what your view is on how you think Micheál Martin is performing. And a lot of people, I think one of the biggest criticisms you hear, and of course I'll refer to social media, maybe I'll ask you about that a little later, but one of the biggest criticisms that people feel, over pub talk or armchair talk, is that a lot of leadership has been handed to Enfit, we'll say, and that people feel that maybe a lot of decisions are being made there as opposed to Micheál showing leadership himself. What's your kind of take on that as a perspective or as a public feeling? Or do you think he's doing a good job as a leader? And I'm talking specifically about being a leader as opposed to the decisions he's making, because we know public health is kind of overruling a lot of our decisions at the moment. But from a leadership perspective, how do you view his performance?
Well, rather than personalize him, and I will deal with him in a minute, but first of all, I'd like to kind of make a very strong point. I hope it's a strong point, and that people fully appreciate this. This is one of the weakest governments we've ever had, and there's a reason for that. It's a three-party government, and two of the major components of that three-party coalition didn't win the election. In fact, they lost the election. Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil lost the election. The Greens, you could argue, increased their level of support, so they could, along with Sinn Féin, be depicted as people who had won the election. But the net result from that three-way division within party terms between Sinn Féin, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, more or less on the same, or within a percentage and a half of each other in the actual election, is that you have a uniquely unstable and very weak government in place. Effectively, in the good old days or the bad old days, depending on how you want to look at it, when you had a Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael kind of alternative Taoiseach set up, the parties would have 35 to 45% support historically. And that it represents a mandate. But in fact, Micheál Martin has no mandate in real terms to be Taoiseach. His party sits on 23, 24%. And in fact, that would be the case for Mary Lou if she had been included even in government or as Taoiseach. She wouldn't have a mandate on those kind of figures either. So you're in this very unusual period where the political system has been fragmented to a huge degree, and the Taoiseach, incumbent Taoiseach, will not have a mandate, and that may be the case for the foreseeable future. So we're in a kind of Belgian situation where, you know, as you know, some years ago, Belgium went for a year and a half without a government.
No government, yeah.
Caretaker government. So my view basically is that it's a very unstable and weak government. It may, in fact, sorry, I might be wrong there. It may be actually very stable and last the 5 years, but it's a very weak government. And that's very clear from the pattern of leaking that's going on, one party versus the other. The fact that the poll rating of Fianna Fáil has collapsed and that of the other two participants has actually gone up has also added an additional destabilization to the government. The fact that the deputy head of government, the Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, is deliberately leaking and giving commentary before the cabinet meeting formally announces its decisions and is briefing the media assiduously in a competitive way versus his coalition partners is also weakening and destabilizing the government. I believe I wasn't trying to avoid the point about Micheál Martin. I don't believe he has a mandate to be Taoiseach, first of all, because he lost the election. Two, I do not believe that he did the right thing in the election or after the election in ruling out Sinn Féin as a potential participant in government. I think that was a big mistake on his part.
But he ruled them out even before the election. That December, he ruled out a unison poll.
Hold on, he also ruled
Straight
out Fine Gael as well. So that's
yeah. He went in. He was on the back foot from day one, and so yeah. But I do think that's a principal part of his problem is he's ruling out sitting down with Sinn Féin on anything. But it's hard to know. It's hard to know where it ends. But I suspect a lot of those numbers that Fianna Fáil are losing in what we're calling the poll numbers, they're going to Sinn Féin. They're not going to Fine Gael. But I do think this government will they're stuck to each other, and you could see that when the vote, the entire vote was to a man to seal the birth records for the 30 years. They didn't budge, and you could see that they were in it for the long haul. I'm sure there are some good ministers though in this government. Micheál isn't one of them. I accept that, but there are some good ministers in it, I think, anyway.
Well, yeah. Well, one of my principal problems here is that inherently Martin's position is very weak, and it's not dissimilar to the position Enda Kenny found himself in 2016. Clearly, having lost the election in 2016 to their great surprise, he was in a much weaker position. And so he was effectively a lame duck Taoiseach. I think it was Shane Ross said he was a political corpse when he went to meet him to form the government. You know, it was, you know, I think there's a bit of that about Micheál Martin as well, that it's very clear he's not going to be leading Fianna Fáil into the next election. And it's even possible he may not be even leading Fianna Fáil by the end of this year, you know.
You're going to give us inside gossip. Come on, give us the gossip.
Well, there has been a vote. There has been a vote on no confidence, right? Where did that go? Did that go anywhere?
No, there's been no vote of any of that kind yet.
I haven't heard that now.
Oh,
So-
okay.
When your government is in that weakened position, you can't expect to have very strong government. And I think that's reflected, to get back to a point that Neil made earlier on, is that there is this kind of schizophrenic toing and froing between what I would call the technical advisors on health matters to the government and the right of the government and the cabinet to make their own decisions and show real leadership in relation to this particular crisis. And I don't think that's been resolved. I think there was an attempt to downface, for instance, Dr. Tony Houlihan's advice prior to Christmas, and then the figures jumped up again, and they quickly changed position again. So I really don't think this government has ever, in real terms, got a grip with the COVID pandemic at all. I don't believe those who claim they've done a great job and we're doing fine. And I don't believe in the adverse comparisons with us in the UK. I think the way the UK have rolled out the vaccine shows how efficient the government can be, as is the case in Israel with the rollout of vaccine, that an individual government can make a difference and can save and defend their vulnerable population, elderly people in the main, in relation to this particular pandemic. We haven't done that. In fact, if you look at the record, and this is really quite shameful, that the big numbers of deaths occurred in effectively state-subsidized settings of nursing homes in the early part because of bad practice in the nursing home, because the HSE, or the Irish health authorities, were not vigorous in defending the very vulnerable people who are in nursing homes. In the second half of this pandemic, there has been a huge amount of hospital-acquired COVID infection from the hospital and health services itself. And again, I note that there's a journalist called, I think, Sarah Carey, or a columnist, who's made the point that the HSE will not disclose the true level of hospital-acquired COVID. Because if that was factored in and we had a figure on that, the actual percentage of people who are actually vulnerable to this virus is an awful lot lower. So there's an element here where we're having this very prolonged lockdown, which is damaging lots of people's mental health, but damaging the economy as well. And it's been artificially prolonged for way beyond its usefulness. And at the same time, the numbers we're being fed are being greatly exaggerated because they're not being properly analyzed and they're not being properly assessed in terms of risk and what risk does it pose to certain sections of the population, be it the able-bodied, the vulnerable, or whoever. And so I'm not impressed at all. Now, I do accept, as one of you said earlier on, it's an extraordinary thing, and no government is ever going to perform well in face of such an unusual, unexpected type of crisis like this. But I don't think the Irish government deserves to clap itself in the back in any way on its performance.
Conor, that's really actually very that's very enlightening to hear a former minister with the Fianna Fáil party talk like that. I'm very heartened by this. You were at one point the Minister for Human Rights and Overseas Enterprises, right? And as a former Minister for Human Rights, presumably, you mentioned their statistic massaging and the longest lockdown, all this business. There are a huge swathe of people now, and they were labeled conspiracy theorists or alt-right and all this stuff. But there are an awful lot of affected people now who feel that our human rights are being trampled on by this lockdown. Where do you stand on that as a former Minister of Human Rights?
Well, first of all, I think that we need to get back to basics in a very simple sense. The World Health Organization's website, and it's not only on their website, they've consistently said this from the very beginning of the government, that lockdowns are not the answer. Tracing and tracking, clearly isolating vulnerable people. In fact, I suspect, I accept the criticism. What I'm about to say sounds like somebody who's been wise after the event. And, I want to qualify everything I say in that context, because this has been an extraordinary crisis for anybody to cope. But it does seem to me that it would have saved us an awful lot more money, and we could have had a lot more people going back to work much earlier if we had actually, in a sense, sealed off and advanced very significant financial support and services to the more vulnerable 60 years plus segment of the population at the very outset, and then dealt with the rest of it on the basis of track and trace and trying to get people to change their behaviors and et cetera, et cetera. But that just simply hasn't happened. And what's happened in Ireland isn't very satisfactory at all. If you look at the death toll in the nursing homes and then the hospital deaths that are happening and yet still will not be disclosed, so that we have a very balanced. All I'm asking for here is I'm not one of those, I don't want to use the phrase COVID deniers. Of course, it's an aggressive, it's an aggressive flu with serious public health implications. But I believe that we're in danger now by prolonging this lockdown so long and not being very, if you like, forensic in terms of sheltering the people who need to be sheltered from it, and letting the, what I would call the relatively healthy, relatively not at risk category people to advance back into the workplace. Because I think there's huge mental health implications. Everybody,
Huge.
There's huge long-term consequences for the young people. And you know what I mean? I'm 58, okay, so I'm not like in an argument with myself to be allowed to run off into the workplace or whatever, or socialize or whatever. But I think for young people, I'm a father of 5 youngish children from teenage years down to very young. But particularly the teenagers who are either going to college, first employment, whatever, they're being robbed of a whole experience.
It's horrendous. And I have a daughter myself. It's the same thing.
In a real sense, they're not as at risk as the older cohort. So I think really, it's time for a lot of older people, including older people in government, to give way to these people and give them a chance. Because I really think this is at both the mental health level, expectations level, and also I think in terms of long-term cost, because the cost that's being built up here by the exchequer through the COVID is ultimately going to be paid not by my age group, it's going to be paid by my children's age group in terms of higher taxes, and paying off all the money that the government has put out there because of it.
It's interesting that the 2 gold standards are, like you just said, are Israel from the science point of view, and God save us, Britain from the the Brits have actually got something right. Somebody compared them to the Foinaven of Foinaven was a horse that won the Grand National, remember?
Grand National.
And to have gone from being the bottom of the league table to be the head, it's a very bitter pill to swallow. And I wonder that you probably have no inside information on this, but Stephen Donnelly, and when they sit around, are they aware that they've messed it all up, that they're messing everything up on a continue by keeping us locked down and stuff? It's clear it's not working, right?
Well, I think people are aware. I think there's great instability in the government, particularly in the Fianna Fáil party at the moment, because there is a realization that the message is not being carried. The message is staccato at the best of times. The message is, lockdown, not lockdown. There's been an awful lot of back and forth that really in a crisis. I mean, I'm not likening it to the crisis that we faced back in 2008 to 2011, but there is an important aspect to government that's now being lost, is that even in the financial crisis, notwithstanding the unpopularity of what we were doing, there was a very clear communications policy about the kind of adjustments that had to be made between 2008 and 2011. And the communication wasn't great, but it was certainly an awful lot better than it is now under this COVID crisis. Now it is a different crisis, so I don't want to make an apples and oranges comparison between the financial crisis of 2008.
But Conor, this time around, or certainly in government today versus when you were in government in a different era altogether, pre-Celtic, pre-crash, you got all the goodies from the Celtic Tiger, and then you kind of were left with the crash in your hands, right? And so it was a completely different era of politics. But today, our ministers don't even have party loyalists in their team. They're all imported in special advisors, or last year, their first appointment was a PR guru. That was the title. It wasn't like a world famous epidemiologist or, pandemic expert. It was a PR guru. And if you go back, you served under Bertie Ahern, and you would have sort of been in the family ring of Charlie Haughey. They would never have had outsiders, like outsider Fianna Fáil people, managing their messaging. Do you know what I mean? I get the impression that there's no party people in the inner circle of the Fianna Fáil ministers, or even the Fine Gael ministers. I don't know about the Green Party really, because I have to think they always see these things as lucky breaks and make the most of it until the next time, you know.
There was a phenomenon when I was in government, because I have to be honest about this, there was a period when the numbers of advisors increased. And it was very, I won't say funny, but it was amusing to observe at one level that when you introduce an awful lot of these, what I call unelected special advisors, program managers, call them what you want, that what happens is a kind of internal competition starts. You know, my advisor wants to impress me. He wants to leak something, or she wants to leak something that makes her minister look good. He wants to leak to it. And you end up in this kind of competitive cycle of leaking and trying to impress and posing. And it's not always healthy. In fact, I'm writing a book, a biography of Albert Reynolds, which will be published in September on Albert Reynolds. And I just finished it there a few weeks ago. But this happened, and Reynolds lost his job because of this kind of activity back in 1994, where we had this kind of advisors double guessing or leaking or becoming far too important in the mix and in the picture, and responsibility not lying where it should properly lie with the minister executive responsible for the portfolio and the department. And that's certainly the case. I mean, the number of advisors appointed by this three-party coalition is a scandal. I mean, I think there's something.
It is. Oh, it's absolutely ridiculous. But Conor, my point is that.
You know?
But Conor, my point about the new era of special advisors, I mean, it is absurd. It's ridiculous. Is that they're not party loyalists, which would have been the tradition within sort of the mainstream parties within Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. They would have been all party loyalists. That was all jobs with the boys, and and Labour Party were the same. They only ever had Labour. Everyone that got a job in Labour when the Labour Party were in government were all Labour people, So like it's just that they don't. Maybe that's the difficulty with Micheál Martin. Is that everyone around him they've been bought in. Their only loyalty is to the paycheck as such, not to the party.
Yeah,
have I got that wrong? Or is that just me?
No. Analysts of American politics and 18th century politics in England always refer to what was described as the payroll vote. And I actually voiced concerns about this even many years ago, even before I became a minister in the Dáil. And that is that we have a very lopsided system in Ireland where we've 160 members of broadly 158 of the Parliament. And it's conceivably the case that between the ministers and the ministers of state and the public office holders who are appointed chairpersons of Dáil committees, that you have potentially within governing parties nearly a majority people in those parliamentary parties who are actually wedded to the government's whip system because they have a job under that system. And so I believe that we have too many ministers, for instance. I think, in fairness to Brian Cowan, he actually cut down the number of ministers of state. I ended up with basically responsibility for 2 minister of state positions because of that kind of downsizing of the numbers. But nobody else has thought of doing that since. And I really think we far too many ministers for start, and far too many office holders in the chairmanship positions or chairperson positions within the Oireachtas system. So without a kind of an ambitious both backbench government and backbench opposition people who prepare to challenge their own party on policy issues, you get into a very unhealthy cycle where basically everybody in the Dáil wants to be a minister and nobody wants to stand out and challenge legislation and challenge what's going on from a parliamentary perspective. And that's one of the things I felt that certainly during my own time that was happening, that you had this very strong executive power system developing within Leinster House, where everybody wants to be part of the executive and nobody, certainly within the governing parties, wants to be an independent challenger of what their own government produces in terms of legislation and policies or decisions. And certainly that's not the case, and that's also the case in opposition, that they want to have a go at the government, but ultimately all of the people want to be in government. So one of my arguments is that it's a bit lopsided in Ireland in terms of the executive outlet is the only outlet for a lot of parliamentarians. So therefore, they see it as pointless to be kind of what I would describe as independent voices themselves in terms of legislation and policy, because they think by challenging things too much, they may compromise their chances of becoming a minister. And I think that's very unhealthy in any system.
And Connor, sorry, now I don't mean to give you the impression of a one-track mind, but I another question about leadership and also about communication. Certainly, from my perspective and my little knowledge of politics, what I'm seeing on social media is that we're particularly in the last 6 months, we're seeing a huge influence on government, perception-wise, that social media appears to be having. In the case of point I'd use to say mandatory quarantine, which is something that hadn't been considered by the government, even though NFIL had recommended it. And then there was a huge wave of crying for it on social media. And we remember prime time when Leo was surprised by the audience votes and that. And it feels like we have this rush system, it's raised eyebrows in Europe, and so on and so forth. I'm just using that one as an example. And I know you didn't necessarily have to worry about the dangers and volatility of social media back when you were a minister. But again, playing into the perception that the public might have of leadership, with the social media influence, I'm wondering if you would think, is there a link between the additional hiring of, say, PR gurus and advisors, some which who come from media itself, and the influence that social media is having on the political system and on government? And if there is a link between the two, or if there is a link even between social media and government decisions, how do you think, the government, particularly Fianna Fáil, how do you think they can, put more of their own influence on that, or take back the reins in controlling that? Or are we in that situation of uncharted waters with, modern technology and media? And that's a big question, and it's a lot speculative, but I'd be interested in hearing your views.
I'm very interested because, I think actually, if you take it out of the Irish context and just look at what we call developed democracy all over the world, in what we call the advanced democratic or the advanced GDP states. So, we call it the 22 wealthiest countries in the world that are in the OECD. There's been a huge degradation of democracy over the last 20, 30 years because of these digital online platforms. Because the problem, and it started, certainly was there when I was there, social media had already made its presence well felt, is that what was up to then a 24-hour news cycle has now become an all-consuming news cycle, with traditional media competing with alternative media, online, social media, we call it. And you have this enormous pressure on politicians. One of my arguments here is that actually we should, I know it sounds terrible, people would probably say that's completely wrong, but actually they need more time and need to be given more time to look at seriously the legislation and policies they're generating, rather than responding to media queries or online, as you describe them, rushes or scandals or mini controversies that are generated out of social media and then put traditional media under pressure. I do think what's happening in Australia in terms of attacks on social media that are the social media engines, providers, etc., that subsidizes plain old style investigative inquiry-based journalism is a very, very good thing. And I hope that it's copied here in Ireland and elsewhere, because actually, whether one likes to say this or not, there has been enormous benefits and freedoms that have arrived for the individual citizen, both as consumer and as citizen, because of social and new media. But one of the very adverse effects it's had is that it's basically undermined the traditional inquiry and investigative function of mainstream media. Like, let's be clear about this. We do need in a democracy to have a robust media that not just reports, but rigorously investigates what is happening in Leinster House, what is happening in Davies stockbrokers, what is happening in our banking sector, what is happening in our industrial sector or our health sector. And, if mainstream media is under the kind of pressure it's clearly under for the last 10, 15 years from alternative media, with no real cost equivalence to mainstream media, no big obligation or requirement to be impartial and to be asking significant public interest type questions, there is a danger that this form of media can be overly politicized and politicized very quickly. we saw a lot of heartrending kind of discussion around that subject in relation to the arrival of Trump and then the departure of Trump. So it's kind of interesting that the arrival of Trump was because of his finessing of what Obama had started in terms of his command of online media, his tweeting, his huge following. And then his departure is accompanied by a significant level of censorship and media turning on the same social media, albeit from the owner's perspective, turning against Trump. So there's some very serious issues in the middle of this. Is it appropriate? For instance, and I'm not arguing for Trump. In fact, I was rather relieved and delighted that he was deplatformed or unplugged in the period between ceasing to be president but being in the caretaker role. But I think it raises very significant issues about our democracy, that a commercial private interest can decide what you and the rest of us and the public are entitled to see or hear. I think that's a very profound issue that really has to be addressed, because and the other issue is that online media has and can basically defame anybody it wants. And you've seen that with the Breitbarts and all sorts of people who've been able to defame people. And yet mainstream media is hamstrung by libel, defamation laws. And, I think that's appropriate. And I think we need to kind of look very seriously at redistributing money from these big, huge, I would call it, industrial behemoths in social media, who have huge, enormous power, through their use of algorithms, can actually interfere in elections. And we've seen interference, not just in relation to the American elections, but there's been interference all over in many different parts of the world in the political system. And it is very easy to create, using, we call it the Cambridge Analytica type technology, to change people's hearts and minds, to change them even within election cycles. And I think that's a very dangerous thing.
Well, Connor, could I interject there? I mean, that's a really interesting observation, and it's if you're familiar with Adam Curtis and his work with the BBC prior to being fired, he posits the idea of a post-political landscape. This is before COVID, right? Because he could see the rise of these behemoths, as you call them, these huge information centers, Google, Facebook, all those guys who are pretty much. So there is a big problem there with, no fan of Trump here either, but free speech is free speech, and deplatforming people at a whim of some technological oligarch is a problem. That's a problem for me. Unfortunately, it was Trump we're talking about, but if it was me, it'd be a big problem. So how would you propose that? Media is, the cognoscenti. We had another guest on a couple of weeks ago who made the statement, but like, print media is dead. That's what he reckons, and I'm very sad to see that, but I would have to agree. It seems to have lost its teeth. There are no really strong investigative journalists. There's one or two honourable exceptions in Ireland. I won't name them now, but we probably know who they are. But that's it. That is it. And it's the same everywhere else. It's the Rupert Murdoch, it's the Dennis O'Brien's here. It's all of that stuff. So how would you propose actually stopping that or dealing with it? Who would have the teeth to do that?
Well, I think, in fairness, I don't want to keep quoting the same thing I mentioned earlier on, but I think the Australians have made a huge start here, is to redistribute, in effect, tax the huge social media operations and organizations and search engines, and force them to cross-subsidize mainstream investigative journalism through what we've described as Broadsheet. And I suspect in the long run, we're going to have to look at somewhat, if I hate to use a markets analogy, but we will have a pink slips market in journalism and opinion, and then we have to have a somewhat more regulated framework for mainstream media, because I think one of the big dangers now is that if we continue with what I would call unregulated journalism of the online social media type, we inevitably get into what I would call the black propaganda machine thing, where there's a kind of, it almost becomes impossible to tell the difference between utter lies and half-truths and then the truth. And this is a very dangerous situation for democracy, where people get in the grip of an idea because of very clever usage of algorithms to a particular kind of propaganda that either demonizes a political viewpoint or an individual's viewpoint, or indeed an ethnicity, or some what I would call bogus threat to a society, can be hugely exaggerated. So I think it's a huge issue that we need to look, like the Australians are now doing, subsidizing what I call inquiry-based journalism. That may not be print journalism. I think that's important to say that. I don't think any effort to rescue what I would call old-style media is going to work. But I do think that inquiry-based journalism has to be a huge component of democracy. That if we don't have genuine inquiry-based journalism, well, really, you're then thrown back on the state always vindicating their rights and the truth of a situation. And I think that's really beyond the competence of the state in all and every setting, because the state has its own job and its own partisan viewpoint. In fact, one of the things I'm very concerned about when I look at the whole atmosphere around the pandemic is that most of the mainstream media in Ireland is now effectively purchased by the government, because the drop in advertising revenue now means that the government basically has the biggest budget in advertising. And there's an inevitable pressure on journalists within Ireland and possibly in England, possibly everywhere, given the shrinking of the private sector advertising and the growth in importance in terms of their survivability.
Yeah, but the government were always the biggest customer for newspaper advertising. They always were. Back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the government were always there. Were always sort of the best client, the best customer to have. Whether you were a Sunday newspaper looking to sell ads, or whether you were, a bakery looking to sell bread, slice pans into what would have been the Eastern Health Board hospitals or something like that. The government has always been a customer everyone wants. Even today, everyone wants government gigs. So, like lads, they look at broadband, look at everything. They all want government gigs. They all want special advisors gigs. That hasn't changed since the founding of the state. What has happened is the quality of journalism. It's the profession itself has let itself down. Maybe if they monitored their own members. I mean, I'm part of a profession that's heavily regulated.
I think the point I was trying to make or get to, that maybe I didn't express it very well, was that I think because of the importance of the search engine, the importance of online social media, we're going to have to rebalance and effectively get to a position where one has insurable and somewhat more regulated mainstream media, and then you have the unregulated sector, and the public then at least can make a distinction in terms of the old phrase caveat emptor. If they're going to invest in beliefs and views generated by an unregulated news media sector, they can have the good sense and common sense to be able to distinguish between what I would call unregulated purveyors of opinion or alleged fact in a mainly unregulated media sector versus a sector of mainstream media that is publicly subsidized but is accountable in terms of facts and regulations for fairness and impartiality and the rest of it. But I think at the moment we're in this halfway house where mainstream media is basically chasing online media to be more sensational. And there was an earlier expression of this when I was a journalist myself many years ago, where broadcast and electronic media basically started changing print media's news priorities because television was more instantaneous. So this around the period of the global TV stations coming, the CNNs and otherwise, that suddenly print journalism lost power to what we call broadcast medium's power. And let's be clear about this. There's nothing that unusual about the arrival of online media. Effectively, one of the main reasons, for instance, the British Parliament, the original Parliament of Britain, if you like, had to regulate the press in terms of defamation was because there was a thriving yellow press in England in the 18th century that was unaccountable and could, in fact, defame everybody. And the parliamentarians only moved against it because it was starting it was being used by unscrupulous commercial and other players to undermine Parliament and to, if you like, smear Parliament, members of Parliament. So the origin of the defamation laws is because of an unregulated, uncontrolled yellow press in the 18th century. And there was a general feeling or need that there had to be a sort of a regulated parliamentary coverage that was reliable and people could depend on, rather than having kind of crises every minute of the week and scandals of one kind or the other that were being generated by vested interests within the commercial sphere. And that's basically the origins of the laws of defamation. And so, you know, if we're to be mature and if we do value democracy, and that's a key point here, if we value democracy and the democratic system, then we do have to look down the road of how we regulate stroke police, what I would call the yellow press or yellow media. And really, a lot of social media is a form of yellow press.
No, there's no doubt about it. And you, I was wondering, did you ever talk to anybody in RTE about this? Because I think they're hemorrhaging viewers in terms of their news coverage. I think that's what's happening there. And you know, as you alluded to, that people are getting their information from online, getting misinformation, disinformation. It's a labyrinth out there. It really is. But when you go away from if you don't understand, if you're in the business of journalism, which you were, and RTE are, or the zeitgeist is, it's very clear what the zeitgeist is, I think, anyway. So it's important that you are very aware of that and act accordingly. I don't think they are. They need advice. They need good advice, outside impartial advice. You know, do you ever consider a role as a consultant for RTE? I'm not offering you a job, but just to be clear.
Haven't they know? Do you know?
I'm not sure they'd have me.
If you think about it, if you remove what you're calling the yellow press, it's like it all generates a type of silt over the government and what's going on in government and in government departments and in semi-state bodies and just the general sort of the public service sector. If it wasn't for them, like, can you imagine what real journalists, or when I say real journalists, I mean sort of the old school journalists, what we'd proper, you know, political correspondence, and what we'd actually be seeing in our government today, like what actually would Prime Minister or Taoiseach's questions actually look like, or what would a face-to-face at the 6-1 News actually look like?
Well, that's a great question, Vanessa, because if you look at, you know, RTE, well, we've the Claire Byrne show, we've all that, Channel 4, BBC, everything is kind of gone to pot in terms of that. There is no teeth in any of that stuff anymore. And that's a worrying development. I think, you know, the news channels we grew up at, or in the last 25, 30 years, that we trust for validity, reliability, ethics, I don't see it there anymore, you know?
No.
I think one of the kind of more disturbing features, as I looked at it now, I'm not saying it was such a long time ago that it wasn't happening when I was there, but you do see a very disturbing phenomenon where, I suppose 30, 40 years ago, mainstream broadsheet media, we call it the Irish Times, the Irish Independent. There was, of course, previously the Irish Press, which I suppose you're all too young.
No, I'm not too young to remember the press, the Harry Hour press.
Where you'll be back, Connor.
But anyway, no, but there was when I started in journalism, there was a very, very serious, still, albeit on its way out, determination in mainstream media to separate opinion from factual reportage. And I think this is one of the big areas where mainstream media has lost its mojo. It hasn't and isn't, over the last 20, 30 years, fastidious about very ethically separating what I call the commentary and celebrity commentary, in some cases, piece of a newspaper from the factual reporting of the newspaper. And this kind of coalescing of entertainment values and strict news impartiality values has been muddied significantly in mainstream media, to the point now that the aspiration for an ordinary journalist is not to investigate more. If you're a young male, female journalist setting out on the road of journalism, you want to get into broadcasting, you want to get into a column, you want to become a celebrity, you want to be maybe on, get me out of here, I am a celebrity. But in the old days, journalists didn't want to be celebrities.
True.
Very serious issue for mainstream journalism. Most of them now want to be either celebrities or in their own mind or in somebody else's mind, some form of thought leader. And to my mind,
influencer.
This is very inimical to the whole point of impartial journalism. The public depend on people who will impartially and hopefully fearlessly go after very inconvenient facts and pieces of information and investigate. Yes, that means investigating whether the teacher did leak, or yes, the teacher may have breached the lockdown. It requires a very strong, impartial mindset. And I don't believe if you're kind of positioning yourself in career terms to become a government advisor after you've finished being a columnist and a generally well-known thought leader type person, it's very hard to be a challenging journalist to the government that may next week be employing you. And I think that gets back to your point earlier on, Vanessa, about these recycling of journalists into positions as press spin doctors for government ministers. I don't think that's particularly healthy, and it isn't a great sign of
and also look what's happened to, okay, like them or hate them, it doesn't matter, Gemma O'Doherty and Kevin Myers and people, they've been drummed out of business pretty much. Now, I didn't agree with a lot of things, and I still don't, but they were, Kevin Myers was always a very interesting read, always had a strong position on something, as did Gemma. Now she's gone a different route now. I'm not saying it's not a question of right or wrong, but they were clearly very
independent.
I would say
they were independent.
I think they were very independent thinkers. I think, maybe not popular thinkers, but that's not the point, of course.
No, but I mean, if you look at, if you go back to, say, Nell McCafferty originally, she was quite unpopular.
Well, she was problematic. Nell was. Yeah,
even if she was problematic, I mean, her coverage. I'm saying this as someone from that generation, but her coverage of the Lynch Tribunal was, in my opinion, the only accurate day-to-day account at the time.
But I can vividly remember my father's period in politics, where Nell McCafferty was basically discouraged of practicing. She did question, and even as far back as my father's time, inquired into what their exact expenses they were getting as members of the European Parliament. This caused extraordinary huffing and puffing by the political class of which my father was then a member. But, that's what I'm talking about, that you need people who are prepared.
Thorns in the side, absolutely, yeah.
If it seems and appears to the general orthodox wisdom that it's vexatious, the person has been vexatious. And the person I cite most in this case who did do a great service to journalism is Vincent Brown. Vincent Brown, the only journalist who got up at a press conference with the Taoiseach of the day, Mr. Charles High, and said, "Where do you get your money from? Your Taoiseach salary is the bottom, yet you live in a huge period home and have an island of your own, and you're wearing all this wonderful gear and whatever." And everybody at the time kind of poo-pooed him and said he was a sort of a kind of vexatious journalist. At the press conference when he asked her, we're embarrassed he was asking it. And so, but that's my point. You do need, I am a fan of Vincent Brown's, believe it or not. And I believe that we need more Vincent Browns of that kind, prepared to say, hang on a second, Minister. Hang on a second.
That be you, Connor.
The rules be as follows, and are you adhering to those rules?
I think you're the man for the job.
For what job now?
I mean, Vincent Brown.
I've already been offered a job in RT. Which job?
You don't need RT. Listen, but this is the thing about this new age. You don't need RT.
That's right.
You can do it here.
I'll have to do my own podcast soon.
There you go. We can do it here for you.
I'm conscious of the time, and before Vanessa starts suggesting Connor sets up a TikTok account for himself, we've just a few minutes left, and usually at this point of the night, and thanks for giving up a lot of your time, Connor, to chat to us. Usually at this point of the night, we kind of lighten the mood and talk about things that have kept us going through the pandemic and through lockdown. And I'm just curious from yourself, from your own perspective, Connor, is it books, is it TV, is it movies? When you're not talking politics, when you're not focused on matters like that, what's keeping you distracted?
I suppose it's some element of movies. Yeah, I watched a nice movie the other night with my daughter. Ralph Fiennes in it. It's about the huge excavation in 1930.
Oh, the dig.
Yes, that was lovely. Yeah,
the dig. Yeah, I was disappointed in Kerry Mulligan, but I thought Fiennes' character was brilliant. Yeah,
I enjoyed that. That was very good. Gentle.
Yeah. I think it was interesting. It reminded me of the remains of the day. They're so
exactly. Yeah.
Excavator wasn't given status at all. I thought it was very interesting at the end of the movie that it took kind of to the 80s or 90s before his rule.
Guys, I'm going to change my backdrop because I want to I want to highlight somebody in particular. By the way, that was my tribute to the new primetime set. I'm swapping out my
who's that?
Teenager.
Move your head there, Vanessa. You're right the way.
Haven't you see it? No.
Who's that?
Can you not see?
Should I know her?
That's Emerald Fennell.
Is she Kardashian? No, I don't know. Who's she?
No. Jeez. I tell you, the teenager said to me about a couple of months ago about Emerald Fennell was born after I did my leaving cert. And I said, are you fucking joking me? Right? Emerald Fennell is, first of all, she was the showrunner for Villanelle, the TV show that just broke all records. No. And then
hold on, have I had a stroke? I have no idea what you're talking about. What was that show? Am I missing out and stuff?
Show about the assassin with all the disguises, and the girl from Grey's Anatomy was in it, and Fiona Shaw was in it.
Okay.
Right. Anyway, she was showrunner for that. She played Camilla in The Crown, and then
this is why I would never.
Yeah, no, this gets better. For me, the movie of the year, right? And I really do hope it cleans up at the Oscars for all the actors and everyone involved. A Promising Woman. She wrote, produced, and directed A Promising Woman with Kerry Mulligan. Well, Kerry Mulligan plays the lead, but this girl who was born after I did my leaving cert.
What's the point? What's the point? She's very, very young. What's the point you're making about the leaving cert?
I know, because the teenager pointed out how prolific this girl already is, right? And she's the first woman, well, British woman anyway, to be nominated for an Oscar for directing, producing, and screenwriting, all for the same movie.
Fantastic.
Did a lot. And I was looking her up today. I found out I don't know if anyone remembers, there was a jeweler. Her dad's the jeweler, Theo Fennell. Does that ring a bell with anybody? Of course, I can't afford his jewelry.
I'm outside. I don't know any of these references. What the hell?
Which jewelry? Where in this jewelry?
So sorry.
O'Connell's The Happy Ring House. I know that place.
It's posh jewelry. Serious designer jewelry.
Right.
I can't afford her dad's jewelry. If somebody wants to buy me, someone wants to buy me a piece of Theo Fennell jewelry, but that's Emerald Fennell anyway. Incredibly talented, incredibly prolific. So you can imagine the career she's going to have. Like, if this is where she is already, and she's only about 15. No, but it's the movie. I meant to bring it up with us a few shows ago. A Promising Woman. It's an exceptional piece of work. All the casting in it, the acting, the premise, the writing, the performances, every part in it is just brilliant. And I highly recommend it. A Promising Woman, and I really do think it's going to set records at the Oscars. If it doesn't, there's something pretty scabby shabby wrong with how the Oscars are selected.
The Oscars is a paragon of integrity.
And come here, have you played at the Oscars, Jimmy?
No, I haven't played at the Oscars. No.
I can genuinely say, Vanessa, I won't. I'm none the wiser, and I won't be watching that. Thanks anyway.
Thank you. Yeah, completely.
Jimmy, I think you have something you're going to share with us tonight.
Oh, it's a bit of serious. A good friend of all of ours, and John and Shay Healy is very, very ill at the moment, and he's in Vincent's Hospital with sepsis. So it's a very tough time. I haven't been able to see him in a year because he's been, with lockdown and stuff. So we're sending our best. So if you got a God out there, just pray to him, or do whatever you do, light a candle or do something, wherever your orientation lies. But send good thoughts or whatever.
Well, we will. Well, I suppose he's never going to be fully well again, but we wish him well. And I know you're very important to Jimmy as well, so that makes you important to me. So, we're with you on this one.
Well, that's just put that out there. And it's just, he has been a great mentor and a friend to me for all my life. So it's a very sad time. But there you go. It's a tough time for a lot of people.
It waits us all. So, Mir, do you know what's great telly to watch, lads?
No, Gomorrah. I'm watching Gomorrah. Have you watched Gomorrah? Relentlessly grim Italian drug lords. Seriously.
No,
grimness is the mood. I talked about the zeitgeist there.
You see, you watch all this serious shit, right? Let me tell you now what you need.
You like fellas boxing the head off each other with no shorts on.
Yeah,
I know
I do, but that's
I got a chance to watch
a bit of eye candy involved. Let me tell you what you need to start watching now. Is it to be eye candy for you hearing this as well? It's Below Decks. It's a reality TV on luxury charter yachts.
No. Nah. There's something to do.
Fantastic television.
Electric Fence. I won't go any further. No, there's no way. You'd have to chain me down to watch that.
Listen, I'm going to talk Professor Luke to hiring a luxury yacht and taking us all away for a few days so we can hang out with these people on the deck. I tell you, it's brilliant. Below Decks.
I'll share some entertainment news that's more politically relevant to what we've been talking about tonight. The Crown have cast Tony Blair, or they've made an offer, a casting offer on Tony Blair, the character to play Tony Blair. Do you know who they've asked?
Irish fella.
It is.
Tony Blair himself. No. Tony Blair.
He's the sexy priest, or the hot priest. What's his name? He's in Fleabag. The priest in Fleabag. Is it Jamie Doran?
Oh, the Paddy. He played Moriarty. He
played Moriarty in the Homes, yeah. So he's been offered the role of Tony Blair. So he's about the same age as what Tony Blair was when he was Prime Minister of the UK. So his official comment was he has some scheduling challenges.
Has he turned it down?
He hasn't turned it down. Hasn't turned it down. Joe, what did I say?
It's Andrew
Scott. What did I say?
Scott.
Jamie Doran. Andrew Scott. Sorry.
Andrew Scott.
What was I thinking? The sexy priest or whatever, the hot priest. I can't remember what his nickname was.
Yeah, he's a fabulous actor though. Brilliant actor. Come here. What's happening with James Bond?
Oh, I'm not up on James Bond. As we pushed it out again. They had pushed it out again.
Idris Elba, I heard last.
Oh, who's playing James Bond? Oh, I don't know.
Okay.
Idris Elba was tipped. But look, we've run over time. We have beds to go to. There's not a child in the house washed. I just want to thank our guest tonight, Conor Lennon, for joining us and giving up his time. Conor, thanks very much for joining us. It was very, very insightful. A lot of interesting views you've shared there, and some quite refreshing commentary as well, coming from someone who is a former minister. So it was great to get your thoughts on those.
Hang on, Neil. We never asked Conor, would he go back into politics?
My official response to that, and I never say never with regard to that, but I think I have 5 kids now and I've enough responsibilities. I'm not sure. But for me, but I've always said, because in fairness to it is a really great thing to do, and a great honour actually to be elected to the Dáil. It only struck me about the first day of the Dáil. I always remember looking over Dick Spring. I'd reported on him, but it was extraordinary to be in the same chamber as all those people that you see. And we've been hard on politicians. I'm just as hard as anybody else on politicians when I write about them. But most of the people in Ireland are honest. Back to the theme earlier about corruption. The vast majority, 90% are honest, and then there's kind of an ethically challenged group of about 3-6% who.
Yeah, but the revolution starts here. Did you not know? That's we're heading. We're bringing a whole new era of ethics to this country.
We're enforcing them with pitchforks, yeah. But
we're doing it our way.
Too much about ethics when I was in politics, but I do feel because of the size of the country, we do have to kind of lift the bar quite considerably. It's really easy for people to perceive in like this gathering here tonight. If you won something, if you got a job in RT tomorrow and there was an RT person here, they might suggest things. So I think it is a requirement in Ireland because in a sense, a lot of people live in each other's pockets. We're all very close.
It's true. It is true.
So there has to be safeguards and there has to be lines of defense to the independence. But you see, the party whip system denies independence as well. You know what I mean? And I think that puts a lot of good people off politics, is the party whip system. It's absolutely why I wouldn't go and join a political party.
I am a fan now. Some people say I'm in favour of all sorts of good things now that I've left the business, but I actually think we should look at the old Greek thing of draw lots. We should have an upper house, which is actually like but a lower house that's actually drawn by lots in the same way a principal and jury service, and is recycled every few years, so that actually ordinary members of the public become empaneled to become members and make decisions. That's not.
It sounds like a proper republic. Neil is given out.
It does sound like a real
us.
republic, yes, indeed.
Yeah, Vanessa, you have to save the questions for during the show, not when we're trying to log
I know.
Again, thanks.
Get a word in.
Thanks to Conor for joining us. The man who wears the crown of the North Side, Jimmy Smith. You are the crown of the North Side.
That's vaguely loyalist, and I'm not at all of that bent. So I'll accept it in these.
Accept it graciously and give a bow.
Fair.
And the Royal Highness of Crumlin, Vanessa Foran, thank you. Thanks for joining us. I'm not going to name all the people who are passing the comments in the chat box, but a lot of interesting discussion in the chat box as well tonight. We'll be back on the site tomorrow and back hopefully next week. Stay safe, stay within your 5K, and good night.